Hi everyone, and welcome to this Fane Online event. I'm Oric Williams, and I'm here talking to the incredible Varaidzo about her debut novel, Manny and the Baby, which hopefully you can see there, has an amazing cover and even more amazing content. Hi, Varaidzo. Um, so the first question I wanted to ask is not. I was thinking like, I don't want to go in with like generic questions. I want to ask her something like interesting, but then sometimes generic questions are also just the questions people want to know the answer to the most. So my first question was going to be, where did you meet these characters? It was going to be, how did you come up with the title of Manny and the Baby? But when you read the book, that's very clear. But where did you sort of meet these characters? How did you find them, or how did they find you?
Um, the first character is Ezekiel, which if you've read it probably makes a lot of sense. Like the whole story kind of really revolves around his appearance in these other people's lives. And his story was the first one that I had. I was so clear, like that he bumped into these two sisters and he played trumpet and he was a mimic and all of these things. So he was really the original character. But I felt like I didn't know Ezekiel in the way that I would have needed to in order for him to be the main character, which is why then we have the perspective of Rita and her kind of trying to figure him out because I was very much trying to figure him out. So that's how the 1930s strand came about. And then the 2012 strand, like I think they're just kind of based on people I had crushes on when I was like in my early 20s or in my teens. Um,
Amazing.
that's they felt familiar to me in that kind of way.
Mm.
Um, so they're written with a lot of fondness.
They are. I don't think I dislike a single person. Well, actually, no. I dislike Dave, but that's because, there's reasons for that.
Yeah,
Um,
good day. He's written to be disliked, so
okay, good, good, fantastic. That's perfect. Because I didn't even dislike Kane. I was like, Kane is being protective. Kane is being Kane. I'll let him slide. And
Kane
also
is
because he doesn't end up, yeah, he doesn't end up doing any foolery in the end. So, also there might be some slight spoilers in this conversation. So if you haven't read, look away now, pause, go read the book, and then come back.
But I do think all of these characters in their own way are quite jarring. Like they have little nuances and little ways of interacting and communicating and being around each other that I find personally like very quite irritating. And also a lot of them are traits that I have and that I do myself and that I was trying to figure out through writing.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it was quite good for me because I got to write these kind of irritating, jarring people, but with a lot of patience and a lot of care
Mm.
and like and love.
Yeah.
Um, because yeah, so it's been quite interesting seeing how people respond to the characters because some people fall in love with them and some people
Mm.
are like, why are these people doing the things that they do? And can they stop?
But I think that's the mark of a really good writer, because when people react viscerally to someone, that means they're real. That means they feel real. If someone's very 2D on the page, it can be hard to emotionally connect with them, whether in a negative or positive way. So
Mm.
I think that's a testament to you and being able to write people that feel so real. I felt like I was in the room when Itai and Josh were just sitting there in silence, and I was like, this is awkward, but also kind of cute. I really loved that. So I
Yeah,
think that
because
works.
with their whole so Itai and Josh are two characters that kind of exist in 2012 and they both sort of have their own narratives and they lead two different narrative strands. But most of their scenes together is literally just them watching television. They don't do anything else. They're just sat on the sofa watching television. And I love that because I spend a lot of my time doing that. Is like I feel so close to my people when I'm just in their space and like we might not even be talking but we're just sat there and enjoying each other's company and I think that's a really beautiful part of being alive. So I wanted to write that and still be able to just write these very mundane scenes but like build so much tension there.
I agree. And I think there's something beautiful about the mundanity of just sitting there watching TV with someone, not having to say anything. There's also a comfortability that comes with silence. So many of my friends who I'm really close with now, I'm close to them because we can just sit there and be in silence. And to create that in a book, I think is really, really powerful. And to give that sort of comfort that you have between these two people where they're kind of strangers really, but in their silence they become not so much strangers, and Josh becomes kind of protective of Itai. It's like he's not doing anything, or he's lobbying people like, leave him alone, he's not doing anything, he's just there watching TV, listening to tapes, like he's actually not doing anything at all. And I think that's amazing. And speaking of 2012, I thought it was a really interesting time to set the present, more present day Strand. I loved the mention of the Olympics. I love that it was set around the Olympics. I love the multiple mentions of Usain Bolt because obviously that's everybody's guy. I also loved, in particular, when Itai is obviously on FaceTime and he's watching the opening ceremony with Alicia, and they're talking about the different countries that they rep, because it's not just one country, they rep this one and this one and this one.
Yeah.
And I love that. And so I was wondering what made you choose that particular period of time, and also to sort of leave it there. Because I know that you obviously started the idea or had the idea for this book a long time ago. So I'm wondering whether it was then that you had the idea, or that it just felt like 2012 was just the perfect time to set it because of everything that was going on.
It was set in 2012 because the 2012 sections are set in Bath, and I left. So I lived in Bath for like 6 years, and I left in 2012. So that was just the last reference point I had for the environment that they all live in and the environment that I was writing to. And I think the idea came about late 2017, early 2018, I think is when the idea came around, which wasn't that, like 2012 was quite recent then. So it didn't seem like I was setting it really far in the past. And it was set around Olympics, so it made sense for it to be 2012 because it's their athletes and it's an Olympic year. It didn't really feel like I was setting a book far away. But obviously now it's 2024. 2012 isn't much, like that's over a decade away now. And it was kind of interesting as different edits of the book came about to reflect on actually what 2012 was. And 2012 was weird. Like we had, particularly because the Olympics were here, and you had athletes like Jessica Ennis, right? And there was this, I remember this being this whole like narrative around Jessica Ennis being mixed race and being the face of British athletics, and like we were part of this like what do they call it, the melting pot of Britain, where we've got these like mixed race superhuman athletes. It's like, this is not okay, like this, it was just very uncomfortable, and it was a lie. Like the Britain was not this like melting pot racial utopia then at all. But it was being sold to us like it was. And then obviously immediately after 2012, then you got things like, you know, Brexit happened, and we all know that Brexit, the vote went that way because there was so much anti-immigration rhetoric in mainstream media. So it's like, what were we doing in 2012? Why were we creating this lie that just didn't exist? And I found that really interesting to then go back to, because I do think that was a really important shifting period for Britain and for England and the country that we're all living in now, the country that has become.
Yeah, I love that. I also love that the plainness of that particular time is that you were just living in Bath, and that's the last time you were there, and that those are the core memories that you have of that time and being there when that was all happening. And there was something you mentioned when you were talking about the Olympics, and you know, the conversation about Jessica Ennis and her race and things like that, and it made me think about identity, particularly identity in the book. And there's a scene where Josh refers to himself as English, and I find it interesting that he says English rather than British. And then there's another conversation about sort of acceptance, and between Marjorie, Manny, and Ezekiel, and they're talking about where they belong, who they really are, what belongs to them, what's African and what is British. And I just wondered how you thought about identity when you were writing this book. Was it informed by those conversations that were happening in 2012 around the Olympics and athletes and things like that? Or was it informed by conversations you've had about your own identity and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think how we speak about race is just endlessly fascinating to me, and the way that I get racialized has changed depending on like where I'm living, who I'm around, and also just like the shifting kind of terms that we use. And for me personally, it's constantly been an evolving thing. There's been a constant evolving language around how people describe me or describe my race or describe my ethnicity. Which I just find really interesting. I've never been that kind of confused. Like I've always identified myself as Black, and that's not really a confusion for me. I think that's like on a very basic level how I look. but because I'm also mixed race, it's just for a lot of other people, there's other things that it's just a bigger conversation for a lot of other people, and they have different perspectives on it to me. And I do find that quite interesting, because it's like, so what is actually the function of this language? Like, what is the purpose of it? What are we doing here? And I think especially in Britain, and how quickly Britain has been changing in terms of like how the demographics exist here. We are quickly developing new language to speak to that. And I think, you know, the bit about being English or British, I think Britain, the word Britain served a really kind of, a lot of people call themselves British because they came from countries that were colonized by Britain. Like, I come from a country that was colonized by Britain, and if you come from a country that was colonized by Britain, you do feel some sense of ownership to that word. And that's a conversation that they have in the 1930s. But obviously, if you've been in England and you're like 6 generations deep in England, you're English, you know? A Welsh person is Welsh before they're British. A Scottish person is Scottish before they're British. They have very different what's the word? They have just a different attachment to the word British. And I think if you're an ethnic minority, you don't really get to just say that you're English. I don't know if you'd want to, but it just doesn't really happen. And that those conversations are just endlessly fascinating to me, you know, is that why have we decided that you can have ownership over the word Britain, but you can't over English in the same way? Because my Black Scottish friends don't feel that way. They're very comfortable saying they're Black Scottish. But if you're Black English, it even sounds a bit strange. Like,
it doesn't roll off the tongue.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. And I just think, yeah, all of that kind of evolving language is super interesting to me. And it's also not something that I think there's a right or a wrong way, or that I have the answers to, but it's just something that I wanted to put down and be like, these are conversations that are being had. Like, let's have a look at that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think also another conversation that the characters have in the book that I think is really really fascinating and got me thinking a lot was about the sort of concept of home, and sort of belonging. And for Itai, you've got the fact that he's in Bath trying to discover himself, trying to discover this part of himself that he doesn't feel connected. It's not even that he doesn't feel connected to, it's just that he doesn't know. He never knew before. And suddenly it's there and he's got all these things to discover. And then for Ezekiel, there's a part of him that he's like, I'm not from here, I'm not from there. And I just remember reading it and thinking like, oh my gosh, I feel so sad for you, because you don't feel tethered to anything. You don't feel tethered to anything. And there's no place that feels like it sort of owns you, or it wants to own you. And so I thought, it got me thinking about the idea of like what it is to you that makes a home, or who makes a home, and what kind of drew you to concepts of home when you were writing. And did it maybe change as you were writing the book? Did you think, oh, okay, Itai's got this place, you know, London is where he's from and what he knows, and then he's got this new place that he maybe thinks could be a new place for him, and Ezekiel has nowhere and he's constantly trying to find a new place. He's got this little suitcase that has all his belongings in it, and that's all he has, and that's what he takes with him, and that's the only real concept of home that he has. And then obviously there's that scene where he meets, or where he sees the dog of you know who, and it's kind of like, oh, maybe this place is the place he's meant to be tethered to. So yeah, it got me thinking and wondering like what the different ways that concepts of home kind of evolved for you when you were writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived in lots of different places, so I don't really have. I've always felt a guest in other people's homes, and my parents were kind of, the upbringing that I was given is that I was very much placed in other people's homes, you know, like over holidays or whatever, in vastly different kinds of environments and geographical locations, and they was just like, yeah, but you belong here, like these are your people. Which is like probably very useful to be a writer because it gives you lots of perspectives, but in terms of like fostering a sense of community, it's like there's too much going on, there's too many directions I'm being pulled in. It was interesting. So home is something that I'm constantly trying to figure out what that means to me and what my relationship to home is. And I think writing this book was part of that exploration. It's not like I had a sense of what home is and then I wrote the characters with that in mind. It was that I wasn't sure what it meant to me, so I created characters and their situations specifically to explore those feelings within myself. I mean, like Rita, the main character, is from Liverpool because I moved to Liverpool midway, like during the writing process, and I love that city. I felt so at home at that city, even though I've got no connection to it. I mean, I've got family that live there now, but we're not like from there. I don't have like a genealogy that links me to Liverpool at all, but I was there and I was like, this city is amazing.
Mhm.
And then so yeah, Rita's like her being from Liverpool was an homage to me feeling at home in that
Mm.
space. But like my core answer to that is I feel at home when I'm with family. Like that's if I'm and family, I mean that in like a broad sense. Like that could also be like, you know, my closest friends, like they're family to me. But when I'm with people that I feel like know me deeply and love me deeply, that's gotta be home. And that's kind of I feel like what Manny and the Baby seeks to explore. Like they're trying to find where they're loved. All the characters are. They're trying to
Mm.
find, you know, where's my space where I can just be. And sometimes they have that and they don't realize they have it, and it takes them going to a different environment to realize that home was, you know, what they had before, where they were all along, all of this. But I think that's a journey that most of us go through.
Yeah, agreed. And also just thinking about not only the different places that you span, but also the timelines which we talked about. There must have been a lot of extensive research, and I know at the back in the acknowledgements you've got a list of resources that you looked at, and also people who helped you. I, for one, am really lazy. I don't think I could ever write historical fiction because I hate research. Um, but I really give kudos to you and people like you who do the research and really make the world feel alive. Everything about that time, I didn't feel like I was ever in 2012 and I was supposed to be in the 1930s. I didn't feel like I was in the 1930s when I was supposed to be in 2012. So talk me through that research process. How was it for you? Did you enjoy it? Would you do it again? What are the most
Oh, I
fascinating
love
things that you
it.
discovered?
That's more fun to
Oh,
me than writing the book. Um, I mean, if I'm being really real, I would have liked to have been a historian that wrote a non-fiction about jazz bars in the 1930s, but you have to do vigorous work to do that. With fiction, you can be a bit loose. Like if I said it happened in fiction. There's a lot less. So that's why Manny and the Baby exists. But no, so before this book, I had been doing like a little digital archive which called Black British Figures, which was just black people that had been in Britain, but like sort of before the Windrush generation, right? Because I feel like a lot of Black History Month content that I would see year on year is that it's like it acts as if Black people would have just been here for like 50, 60 years, which we all know is not true, but nobody actually kind of highlights the real people and what they were doing before then. So it was just this kind of little digital archive I do a little drawing of a person that had been, sometimes they were just like, you know, a bus driver that was around in the like 1901, and that's an interesting story. Or sometimes it might be like a super famous celebrity that was like on the BBC and like did sold out shows and has like since been kind of forgotten from history. But either way, it was just these little drawings and then a description of like who that person was and what they were doing. And I found that really fun. Like it wasn't a project that I did for any reason other than that I loved it. But it really resonated with a lot of people, which gave me confidence in the idea that if I wrote a book that was set in this kind of world of jazz bars in the 1930s, and about Black people back in the day, that there'd be a reception for it and it would be enjoyed. But the research is like that, that's fun to me.
it's
I'll be
light work to you.
listen, I love going down my little Google spirals. Give me a topic, I'll research it. I'm there.
I love it. Also, just a clarification, the Black British figures, they weren't just little drawings. They were incredible illustrations. They're not just little drawings. So you need to give yourself proper kudos for those because those were fantastic and I really
Thank
enjoyed them.
you.
And they
Yeah,
were
to be fair, they
highly
were
educational as well.
they were exhibited at a theatre for a bit at Theatre Peckham. As like actual art. They weren't art in my head. They were literally just doodles, but
They are art.
they were like really colorful, and I think they were quite like useful for kids as well. It's just like as a nice little entry point to be like, oh, this is your history.
Yeah.
It was like, it was definitely a fun project, but like I said, you have to be a lot more rigorous when you're actually speaking about real people's lives, because that's the kind of care that we all deserve. Like if we're going to tell our stories, we need to tell them properly. But with fiction, just make it
Play a
up.
little fast and loose. Yeah. I'm just thinking about research and history. There was a lot of information, things that I'd forgotten that I then remember when you were talking about them, things like Oswald Mosley and the marches and things like that happened. And Haile Selassie, I almost completely forgot that person even existed until you were writing about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. And the idea that he was in Bath and that all this stuff was happening. And the colonizing of places that we didn't really hear about in school. So when you were writing it, just thinking back to the fact that you're also doing the Black British Archives, were you also, did you actively think about wanting to include those sort of almost forgotten histories when you were writing about it? Or did you feel that they were existing and they were just integral parts of the story that needed to be told in order to make this world feel really real and full?
Yeah, I wanted it to be like a bit of kind of like a Forrest Gump kind of like there's beats of the book that are very clearly marked by specific cultural moments, and that's on purpose. Like I wanted it to feel like my characters are at the center of history happening. So there's so many kind of important things that happened for the world, you know, like in the 1930s when Jesse Owens, for example, he wins a medal in the Berlin Olympics. That's a really big historical event that happened, that my characters would have lived through. So I wanted to, you know, acknowledge these beats, because history happens constantly and we kind of don't realize that we're living through history until we look back at it. For them, it's just everyday life. We don't realize the kind of impact of these things until we reflect. So Forrest Gump is really good at doing that.
It is.
I haven't read the book, but I think it's just a really fun kind of narrative structure to be like have just one character that's at the center of everything important that's ever happened ever. So that's why all of those kind of little like actual specific historical moments are woven through. But that said, like it's very much about, I didn't want to hit people over the head with it, is that a phrase? But yeah, I didn't want it to be too heavy-handed, so that you feel like you're reading a history book. I just wanted it to be like, you know, we're just following the waves of time.
I love that. And that is exactly how I feel. And thinking about time, and particularly then about music at the time, how much did you learn? This also sort of goes back to research. How much did you learn about jazz as you were researching and writing this? Because there are ways that you describe the characters, and Ezekiel is playing the trumpet and things like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. I feel like I'm there. I feel like I'm watching everything. I'm hearing the music. How much did you learn as you were writing about jazz, or how much it was just, I was making it up as I go along?
Enough. I didn't really, in terms of, there's a lot of ways this book was really heavily researched, and there's a lot of ways where I did not do my due diligence, and the kind of music parts is one of them. I didn't really do anything. I might have listened to like a few jazz songs that came out in the 1930s, but what we have to remember, is that I started writing this book in like 2018, and I lived in South London. And during that era in South London in 2018, there was a massive jazz boom. Like I could not walk down the street without there being some flyer somewhere for like, I don't know, just some live jam happening. It was a real movement, yeah? Like I spent my early 20s going to jazz bars in South London, trying to make it as a writer. And that's what I wrote a book about. Like that's literally just the life that I was living back then. And then obviously there's quite a lot of themes just with it being a dual narrative of like history being cyclical, and patterns repeating and all of this. And that was literally an ode to like me running about South London jazz bars and being like, hey, this is what people were doing 90 years ago as well. What's really changed?
I love that. I love that you also kind of, you did learn in a way. You learned by osmosis of like being around the music and figured it out your own way.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, take that. And thinking about jazz and then obviously performance, there's a way that you describe Ezekiel in the first few chapters when we first meet him. This is before we even know his name. He's just described as a trumpet player at this point. And it's about the way that he speaks and about the way that when he's performing and he does these speeches, he does these sort of performances, he changes the way he speaks to become this other person. Obviously, later we figure out why and how he's able to do that. But I found it really fascinating. And then there's a way that Rita describes him. And there's a quote that she says, I watched him tour the room. And this is, I think, with at the exhibition. I watched him tour the room with his companion, an older man I recognized from his band, and the way his face changed so easily like a chameleon when he spoke to somebody new. It was as if he orchestrated a different expression for each person he met, adapting it perfectly to what he gauged they needed to see. And I just thought, first of all, beautiful writing, first of all, which I've been knowing. But I was thinking about how you see performance, both in the deliberate sense of, you know, performing for a band, and then also in the sense of becoming somebody else in order to appear a specific way or present yourself a certain way to someone else, and how did you want that to be read in this book? And then do you think any of the characters outside of Ezekiel, and maybe Rita and how she appeared to Ezekiel, wanted to be seen a certain way? Or do you feel like a lot of people were very much at face value, you get what you see, they are who they are?
I mean, I don't, it's difficult. You can't really know what everyone else is doing, right? Like, I know that I know how I perform. I know that I'm a terrible code switcher. Like, I do it without knowing that I'm doing it. And then sometimes I'll watch like a film of myself and be like, that's the accent that I have since when? Like, what's going on? Even when I go to Liverpool, it's diabolical. I really, I put on my little Scouse accent and I don't even realize I'm doing it. Like, I'm such a, it's a thing everyone does. Some people do it more intense an extent than others. But yeah, I do think that everyone, to a certain extent, when we leave the house and we interact with the world, we perform. And that's it's just something that I find really interesting, because it's something that I know that I do, but it also feels outside of my control in a way that it becomes real. Like, it's like the performance is the whole thing, you know. There's not like I think, you know, we use expressions like, oh, just be yourself, be yourself, be yourself, but it's like that gives the idea that there's some whole true self that we have easy access to, and if we just dropped the performance, you know, our real true self would be there. But I feel like all communication, it relies on us following certain social codes. It relies on us understanding certain cultural contexts, and all of this is part of it is a performance. It's something that we can't really 100% remove ourselves from. And I think if we did, we'd be losing kind of a lot of the joys in socializing and communication. I think you know, even like humor and being funny, like that's a performance to a certain extent. You know, there's so much joy to be had in the drama, in the art of performing. But at the end of the day, it can also, you know, feel quite limiting if you've decided that I'm going to be this person and this is the person that the world gets to see me as, and you've created that box for yourself. If you then want to step outside of it, I think that then becomes quite difficult as well. And I think that's sort of what happens to Ezekiel in certain ways, is that he's gotten so comfortable with his performance that when it gets shaken up, he really struggles then with coming back to himself.
Yeah, agreed. It's so sad. Even just the scene where he tells Manny the reason why the thing. This is me trying not to give way too many spoilers. The idea of that, and that whole thing was a performance, and that was almost. I think it's really interesting though, because it's part of his performance and the way that he carries himself, which is performance, is what endears him to Rita. But at the same time, even when she discovers that that's a performance, it doesn't make her love him any less. If anything, I feel like it makes her love him more. Maybe in part of it is sort of in a bit of way of pity, or of, you know, we both have this thing that we're both trying to project ourselves a certain way. We both have to perform a certain way on stage, or try to be certain people in order to help ourselves become those people internally in reality. But I think that's really beautiful, that it doesn't make her think, oh gosh, he's just a fake. It makes her think, oh, he's just a person trying to find himself. He's trying to be whatever he can in order to survive. And that sort of almost makes her love him more than any less. I love that.
Yeah, but she's also a teenage girl with a crush in it. Like, I feel like I was a teenage girl with a crush. My man can do no wrong. It doesn't even matter what his issues are, what his baggage is. I've got a crush, you know. Bless her.
But then I do think it turns into, oh, bless her, she's so sweet. It does turn into I do think it turns into something more mature as time goes on. It
does.
It's almost like it
mature. It follows her kind of, you know, we're with these characters for a few years, so we hopefully see that there's growth in things like that.
Exactly. Someone who doesn't perform at all and feels as straight up as anything is Itai, actually. And I love the way he was, well, maybe with Alicia when she's like, you okay? He's like, yeah, I'm fine. And he's obviously not fine. Also, God bless Alicia, because I don't have the patience that she has. That's how many years he knew her?
Honestly, I would not wait.
She's one of my favorite characters. She's great. she's a ride or die. Everybody needs a ride. Everybody has a ride or die they don't deserve, and I think that she was his, and I love that for him because there's the people you don't deserve, but the people who kind of save you in some way as well. Um, and yeah, one of the things I loved about Itai is that he was just straight up with everybody. He wasn't trying to be anybody else. He was just like, this is, especially with strangers, I guess. It helps. It's easier to be yourself with strangers than with anybody else, and people who really know you. And one thing that he didn't hide at all was his grief. And I think there's something that you write about the immovable permanence of grief. There's a quote that I really love, and you write, Itai sighed. It wasn't the grieving he felt blamed for. It had been the shoe rack in his father's corridor. Couldn't explain it aloud, but seeing it there after the funeral, all his shoes stacked neatly, that would remain untouched now. That's what had got to him. Big boots Itai could never fill. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was so. It's funny, because, well, obviously it's not funny, but it's hard because you read something like that and you're like, oh yeah, that's really sad. And you're like, wait, no, that's a thing that we've all experienced. Someone we know, and we see their things and we're like, oh, that thing's never going to be used again. That thing's never going to be touched again. Um, and I feel like there are different kinds of grief in this book, not just about the grief of someone dying, but of lives possibly lived. Sam and a half, he doesn't get to live the life he wants to live because he has to disappear. He has to, or who knows what even really happens to him. And that's a grief that he has for a life he can't live anymore, and that Rita has for a life she was hoping to live with him, and also just for the friendship that she had with him and the care that he had for her. A love for Ezekiel that Rita has, a love with Marjorie that a person doesn't get to have. I won't say who, because I don't want to give away spoilers. So I just thought about what made you want to write about grief in that way, and did you mean to write about it in that way, or did it just sort of happen as the story sort of came about? And do you think those different kinds of griefs changed your characters or defined them as they went through the book?
Yeah. I don't know why this book is so grief heavy. It wasn't something I wasn't, I've had griefs in my life, but when I started writing, it wasn't something that I was particularly like deep in the middle of experiencing. Mm. I think I think actually what you've said about the kind of, there's griefs that you can have that aren't specifically about death, but it's just the kind of the passing of time is a grief in a way, because it's like we can't stay in the same moments forever. And I also think, if especially like within history, if you lost your notebook that has someone's home phone number, you might not contact that person again. You might not be able to find that person again. And so I think grief was just a lot. It would just, it could happen just with anything, in a way that now we have so many methods to hold on to each other, that when you do lose someone in a very kind of final way, whether it's like a relationship has broken down or you've lost someone, it's like we kind of don't have any practice for it. It's very shocking in a way that perhaps, back in the day where people could very easily lose touch with each other, it might have been something that we grew with more, but I don't know. That's just a kind of theory that I was interested in thinking about when I was writing. But I saw a quote recently that was like, you shouldn't borrow grief from the future, meaning that you shouldn't overstress about like bad things happening before it's happened, because grief isn't, a fun place to sit in, and you don't have to borrow it from the future. Like, we're probably all going to experience heartbreaking griefs in our life. If you're not in that moment right now, you don't have to sit in it. I did the opposite with this book. I very much borrowing grief from the future. I was very much working out some anxieties about like losing loved ones and how I would feel, and also losing histories. When I see like the kind of, and I think this is probably a feeling that lots of people like that grew up in a diasporic community feel, which is that when your elders, or like the connections that you have to the country that you come from before, when they pass on, if you've been in a different country or living in a diaspora, what do you do when you lose that connection? That's something that makes me feel very, very anxious. So I think that was something that I was kind of really interested in exploring in this book. But that said, I've been through, since I first started writing this book, I've gone through some really deep griefs that have been really kind of, that have rattled me and sent me off kilter. And I did actually find a lot of comfort in reading back words that I'd written, not in that space, but that still dealt with grief, you know, in a kind of sensitive way, because it kind of reiterated to me that this is a universal feeling. It's not something that is just solely happening to me. It's something that everyone has a connection to and has a relationship to, and that even when you're not deep in it, you still can empathize, or you still understand the gravity of something like grief. And I think for me, myself, it was a very good reminder of that, you know, is that grief can often feel very personal, but it's not. It's literally the most universal, one of the most universal experiences, because it's inevitable.
That's so true. But I love that your own, that you, even though you technically borrowed grief from the future, it then came back to sort of help you in a way as you were dealing with it on your own. And I think that's beautiful that you helped yourself without realizing that you were going to. I'd also like to accuse you of not helping people, because there is a story that you read at Inua Elam's rap party last year that you said, never forgot about that. We'll never forget. But you said was going to be in the book, but then you took out, which is a sort of deleted scene. And for those of you who sadly were not there at the rap party, you missed out. But it was incredible. And in addition to being an incredible writer, Leah can also sing. She forgot to mention that in the years I've known her. And so she actually sang part of the song that was being played in the story that she wrote. So would you just like to tell the people what it is that you deprived them of?
Yeah, well, it wasn't, I didn't mean to deprive anyone of anything, but the timelines add up. So basically, a lot of characters in this 1930 section, there's like name drops of actual Black entertainers that was big in their fields in the 1930s. And one of these performers that is like very briefly mentioned in the book is Ken Snake Hips Johnson and his rhythm swingers, and they were giant, right? So Ken Johnson was this band leader, and they called him Snake Hips because he moved with his hips when he danced. And he had this jazz band, and it was like the first jazz bands that all of the orchestra was Black, and this was purposeful. Like, it was like he had created a band where everyone was Black, and they rose up to become like one of the most successful bands in the city. So successful that when World War II broke out, they had a regular spot in this basement called Café de Paris, which was a very kind of upmarket establishment. So like celebrities would go there, and these guys would play for them every week. And it was kind of boasted as like the safest club in London because it was a basement, right? So it's like, even if the sirens go off, you're underground already. So like, you're just gonna go to our underground shelter anyway. Why not go to our underground shelter that's a club, right? So the story that I read that didn't make it in the book, just because the timelines didn't quite add up, actually happened during World War II, where basically this band was playing in this basement. Sirens go off. There's, the Blitz is happening. Whole of London's getting bombed, and one of the bombs falls down the chimney of this club, comes all the way down to the basement, lands on the stage, explodes on the stage, and Snake Hips Johnson passes away. I think sort of half the band passes away. A couple other celebrities that were there in attendance passed away. So this really, really rocked British culture, and also put an end to what was, this rising band full of Black people in the 1940s. Some of them survived, some of them, they moved on to other bands, some of them went to Paris, some of them went to America, and they kind of, honored the story of the rest of their bandmates. But the kind of the what ifness of it all, it sits so heavy on my chest, of like what that band, if their trajectory hadn't been cut in such a kind of disturbing way, where they could have been, and what that could have meant for, UK culture and UK music, and just even like how obviously like everyone loves Black musicians now, but maybe it could have been something that was brought into culture sooner if they had kept on the trajectory. But like I said, it's a what if, we'll never know. But I just thought it's like one of the most heartbreaking stories I've ever heard ever. So I wrote a short story about that specific event, just because that event I return to often. I think about it a lot. And that's the thing that I read that or is referring to.
It
But it
was
was never like
fantastic.
I didn't deprive anyone by not putting in the book. It just wasn't really relevant to the story that I was trying to tell.
It's relevant to my memory because I think about it a lot. And speaking of things that are in or out of the book, I wanted to talk about endings, particularly because I remember the other day when we were chatting, you said, what even happens at the end of the book? Because I can't remember. There were so many different endings that we had.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask about how you end a novel and how you decide what the right ending for a novel is.
I always knew what the kind of last page was going to be. I knew there were some characters. So Itai, I knew how Itai's story was going to end, and his story has never changed. I knew where Rita's story was going to end, and her story has never really changed. But Ezekiel, Manny, and Josh, who were the three other sort of main characters, I didn't know. I couldn't work out where they needed to be for everything to feel satisfyingly like we've come to, you know, that there's something has been resolved in some kind of way. Because they're so, those three characters in particular are bubbling with so much opportunity, and I think you can see it with them the whole way. They're all on the brink of something great happening to them. Whereas Itai and Rita, they're kind of just like they take life as it comes a bit more. They're not so it doesn't feel, their greatness doesn't feel preordained, you know, like Rita on a whim is like, I'm going to be a dancer, and she's like, actually I'm kind of good at this, maybe I can be incredibly successful, but it doesn't feel preordained in the way that like Manny's writing, it feels like something that she is destined to do, you know. It feels like he is destined for something. Josh is destined to be a runner, and that was quite a lot of pressure that I put on all of my young characters. So then working out when it came to the end, actually, you know, what became of that, it was really difficult for me to figure out, because I think I felt in my early 20s that a lot of people, I mean, me and you met when we were in our early 20s, and neither of us had books out. And now we do. Do you know what I mean? There were so many people that I met in my early 20s where it's like, I could see there's a potential for things to be really, really special here. But I felt that about everyone, you know, and not everyone can be the most successful person on the planet. It just, things don't work that way. Not everyone even wants to be, you know, not everyone. I've definitely struggled with kind of doing professional jobs that require writing, because it made me lose love for writing. And I think that's quite a common theme, is that a lot of musicians, you think, you know, you have the potential to be the you know, next greatest artist out there, but then they kind of go on that trajectory and they realize, actually I don't even like this, I just like playing my instrument, so let me stop doing that. You know, there's so many different ways for that potential to go. And yes, it's like you when you're in your early 20s, you feel the pot bubbling. And I just wasn't sure at what point I put the lid on. It was really, yeah, it was difficult. They've had lots of different endings, and I believe all of those endings to be real. The one that's in the book is just the one that I think made for the most kind of satisfying end to a novel, because obviously the idea is that, you know, people, that reading is a satisfying experience to some degree. I don't know if the ending that exists in the novel is necessarily what I think happens to all of them, but I think I need to reread it, actually. I could just but I'm happy with where we got to in the end anyway.
Yeah, you could do a different ending for the paperback, confuse the heck out of some people. And actually, I love the thing you said, that not everything, there is so much potential for a lot of people, but not everything is neatly wrapped up and tied up, because you very easily could have said, Josh goes on to the Olympics, he wins the 100 meters, really nicely wrapped up bow. But you didn't, and I like that, because it gives the reader the space for them to think, these are what these characters are, here is what I think that their trajectories could be based on what I've learned from them. You don't have everything laid out, and I think that's good, because I think as writers we have to give our audience a level of intelligent. You have to admit our audience are intelligent, and they have the ability to think of things themselves and to read between lines and to understand the characters in the way that they want to based on what we put before them. And so I think it's great that you don't neatly wrap everything up. You leave room for things. And also, I just love the little reunion at the end. That warmed my heart. They made me very happy. I also love that she was so small. I was like, I love little small black women. They're just so cute. And something you mentioned about Manny actually that I really loved, because when I was reading her, I was just like, she is the most fascinating, incredible. She's kind of who I want to be in terms of her strength, her intellect, her she doesn't perform for anybody. The only way in which she really performs is the way in which she's forced to, because people won't take her seriously for who she is. And I just feel like she's such a force to be reckoned with. And there's a quote that she says that I was just thinking like, oh my goodness. So it's Rita's perspective, and she says, and then my sister's voice soaring over all the others. Remember, having the impression of power is not the same as having the intention to exercise any. First of all, how dare you write something like that? Because that's incredible. I was reading it and I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's just go back and read that again because that was amazing. And I wanted to ask you about how Manny sort of manifested herself and how she grew and how she
I can
became who
tell
she
you
was.
how Manny manifested herself. Manny was based on Una Martin, who is like one of my all-time idols, right? So Una Martin, if you're unfamiliar, which like I think now we're a lot better at honoring Una Martin's legacy, but Una Martin was a writer and a broadcaster. She was the first Black woman to have a play at the West End in Soho. And then she became a producer for the BBC, and she produced this show called Caribbean Voices, which started off with, I think it was soldiers actually during the war, reading out letters to their loved ones back home. And then the war ended and it became a show about Caribbean writing and Caribbean literature. So she put on a lot of Caribbean writers like V.S. Naipaul, like that was
oh wow,
her show. Sam Selvin was on her show, like all of the greats. She put on to the public, like she was a really really powerful voice, and her writing is incredibly firm and incredibly powerful, and I thought she was so cool. And when I was imagining Rita, because we only know Manny through Rita's perspective, and Rita speaks of Manny with the adoration that I speak of Una Martin. I think Una Martin's amazing. But that said, Manny, as I see her as a person, she's a little bit of a problem. She has her own issues, and I think is stubborn to a fault, and struggles, and is so firm in her own conviction that she struggles to see outside of her own conviction. And I found that really fun, playing around with someone that actually is quite flawed, but from the perspective of someone who is just in awe of Manny. And I think a lot of Manny's, I was explaining it to someone the other day, is like Manny is clearly very intelligent and very well intentioned, but that's not always enough, you know. And she complains a lot about like, why is my perspective not heard? Why are all of these, you know, men writing and getting published, but they're not saying anything that's useful, and they're not doing anything of note, and what gives them the right to be able to, you know, be published and all of this and that. But I think that's also a question that she could ask of herself, is that it's like, yeah, what gives you the right, Manny, to be a writer? It's a question I ask myself too. It's a really interesting question, you know. And I really enjoyed trying to answer those questions, but through the perspective of someone who was just like, Manny's it, Manny's everything, Manny's the hero. And
I
she
love
is
that.
as well. I don't want to say that like she is that. I don't want to give the impression that I was like, you know, that Rita's perspective of Manny is wrong in any way. But I think Manny is a lot more complex than like say how I see Una Martin, who I genuinely is just a legend.
Okay, since we are running out of time, I have some quick fire questions for you. Well, the first one is not a quick fire question, it's just me being nosy. What are you working on next?
Some ideas and some things.
Okay.
Working on 2 new ideas simultaneously that are very different, and I'm very excited about both of them. I'm just waiting for my heart to decide which one gets 100%. And when I've made that decision, then I'll speak about them more, I think.
Okay. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. That's just me being nosy. What is the last book you read?
The last book I read, oh, the last book I read was Fast by the Horns by Moses Mackenzie,
Ooh.
which comes out in May, which my casual readers book club India, who hosts that, gave it to me because I'm a big fan of Moses Mackenzie because he's also from the Southwest.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great, incredible. So
Love it.
just keep that on your radar.
Okay. I was going to ask you last book you recommended, but that's clearly the last book you recommended. What's the last film you watched?
How is it called? How to Have Sex? It's the
Oh
one,
yeah, Molly
um,
Manning Walker.
yeah, that came out recently. And it's about just this group of like 16-year-olds that go on like a sort of girls holiday to a
Shagaloo.
yeah party beach and drink a lot and like just kind of yeah, we go through the week with them. And I did an Ibiza holiday when I was 17 with my girls. And it was exactly the same vibe. I think it's great. I think a lot of people I've heard controversial opinions about it amongst my friendship group. A lot of them are not a fan, but I loved it. I was like, this is literally what me being in Ibiza at 17 felt like. I thought it was great.
Amazing. I need to watch it. My friends watched it and she raved about it, so I definitely need to watch it. If you were on a desert island, like your desert island disc, and you had one album you could take with you, which album would you take?
That's such an unfair question. I can't
I I
quickly.
asked you before, do you want to know what the questions are, and you said no. So
Oh yeah, one album. Do you know what? So when I was a kid, every night before I went to sleep, I would listen to The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Um,
Mm.
and it didn't get old. So probably that, because I know that I can tolerate that for a long time. Yeah, and there's so many different like vibes to that album. So maybe it would, yeah, there's enough diversity that maybe it wouldn't get boring.
Love that. Last thing you Googled.
That's a great question. Oh, really embarrassing. Manny the Baby is the last thing I Googled.
That's not embarrassing. That's your book.
It came out a few days ago. So I was just, checking to see if the bookshops are actually stocking it or not.
Baby
Yeah.
stuck in it. I saw it all over foils on Saturday and I loved it. Okay, second to last question. What's your favorite cuisine?
I'm a big fan of Vietnamese, actually.
Mm.
I do like a Vietnamese. I like I mean, I'm from Zimbabwe. I think Zim food it gets people don't appreciate it as much as they
Mm.
should. So I just like to say on the record, we have excellent food. Um, I went to a Somali restaurant the other day. Uh, Incredible. Uh, so yeah, I'm a big fan of. Do you know what? There's not any really any cuisine that I'm not into. I like most food.
Nice. That's good. Even though you mentioned Vietnamese before you mentioned Zin food. Duly noted.
I can't lie. Vietnamese food might have Zim food. It might have Zim food. But I just want to put
That's
on
your
record,
Zim card revoked.
we can if I'm good in the kitchen. I can.
Oh, okay. Okay. Good to know. Okay, and last question. Where can people connect with you online if they want to talk to you about how you emotionally ruined them with this book?
Um, don't talk to me about that. I don't want to emotionally ruin anyone. Um, no, if I'm on it, it's at Practical Myth. I'm not really using Twitter. I'm not really using TikTok. I do use Instagram, but I really only use the stories. But if you're interested in following me, that's where I'll be. That is where I'll be.
Thanks so much for your time, Varaidzo. It's
Thank
been great.
you.
Could chat to you all day, as you know, but really appreciate it. And yes, guys, if you haven't already, go and buy this book. And if you haven't already bought it and you've listened to this whole thing with the spoilers, you should still go and buy it anyway because you don't know it with context. So go buy it. It's a beautiful book.
I'll recommend it to a friend, all of that.
Yes, exactly. Right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.